13 Days in Solem County, Chapter 2. Glad to help. After giving it a bump with his shoulder, the truck door dropped an inch and made a grinding, popping noise as the attendant forced it open. Grabbing the frame above the door with one hand and the headrest with the other, the attendant twisted and slowly extended 1 foot at a time to the ground before pulling himself out of the cab using both hands. Upright, he stood still for a moment as if regaining equilibrium. Finally, someone had arrived that might be of some assistance. Leaping from his perch, Z called out, "Hey!" as he headed towards the attendant. Pausing with his keys in hand and rooted to the spot, the man turned and looked at Z. "Man, am I glad to see you," Z said. Or anyone, he thought. "I'm having a bit of trouble here. Maybe you could help." Expressionless, the attendant stared at Z, no more eager to endear himself than the night before. Z said, "I know it's a tall order to fill, but I need a new tire." Z knew how much a new tire would cost, and also that he didn't have enough money to purchase one. But he had learned on his journeys that if you keep your cool and don't show your hand, things often work themselves out. The attendant stood like a statue. There was ample time for the silence to become awkward before he replied, "No, ain't nowhere like that round here," and promptly returned to his impassive state. So I'm pretty much screwed, Z thought, before asking, is there another town or anything like that around here?" After another small eternity of careful thought, the attendant replied, "Next town's about 80 miles that way." He pointed down the road. "But I don't think they got no motorcycle tire repair shop there." Z knew that it was at least that far back to the last town he passed before coming in from the opposite direction, and he didn't recall seeing any motorcycle tire repair shop there either. Persisting, Z asked, "Man, any way you could give me a ride? I could pay." Quickly, the attendant said, "How much you got?" Caught off guard by this impertinent question, Z felt that sinking feeling come over him, like he had stepped in it up to his ankles. He said with a sheepish chuckle, "Well, not that much, really." "Nope, can't do it." Z's growing despair became difficult to hide as he fidgeted. The attendant remained his only lifeline. "Come on, man, you gotta help me. I'm stuck here. Is there really nothing you can do? I'm hungry. I just need to get my tire fixed so I can get down the road. Is there not anyone else here who can help? Seriously, I just need a hand." After another long minute, the attendant said, "Tell you what, I've got a sawmill back at the house, and I got a friend of mine that needs some boards sawed up to build a room at his place. I don't move like I used to. I'll pay you to saw the wood, and when you've earned $300, I'll take you and your motorcycle down the road and see if they can help you there." Not that he had a choice, whatever the wage, but Z asked, "How much does it pay?" 10 cents a board." Z had no idea whether that was reasonable and guessed he was likely getting the short end of the stick. "What about my room?" "Still have to pay for your room," the attendant said. "I'll just take that out of your pay, and you can keep the rest until you've got enough saved up to take you down the road." It seemed harsh. Z would have appreciated any degree of human decency, any iota of compassion, but the attendant was unwavering. So without further complaint, Z accepted the conditions. With no indication of a shift in conversation, and without a change in expression or tone, the attendant asked, "You don't have any guns, do you?" A little stunned, Z said, "What?" "Any guns," the attendant repeated a little louder. This is a gun-free county. Z observed a gun rack in the back of the window of the attendant's truck. You wouldn't know it by looking at him, but Z came from an upper-middle-class family in the suburbs, and he wasn't raised brawling and certainly not beating up old men. Although wildish, he was soft-spoken and polite. Nonetheless, a question this direct would usually have resulted in Z telling the asker to get bent at the very least. But now, he was at the mercy of this strange individual. Z only humbly replied, no. Well, all right then, said the attendant, pleased. I've got to go in here for a minute, but go ahead and get in the truck, and then we can get you started. Yeah, okay, so I'm starving. What can I get to eat around here? Any grocery store? What about that gas station over there? I've got a little money. Can I buy some food somewhere? Z pretended that he hadn't scoped the town earlier. But the attendant only replied, No, nothing like that around here. Gas station's been closed for years. What about your snack machine? I put $3.75 in it this morning, and it ate my money. Oh, I don't have anything to do with that, the attendant said. Fella comes and restocks it when he feels like it. I think there's a number on it you could call. My phone doesn't work here, Z said. Do you have a phone I could use? No. Determined, Z tried. How about some change? I know you've got some kind of change in there. You made change for me last night. Cornered, the attendant's silent stare returned with a vengeance, accompanied this time by tight lips and jaw. Z, for the life of him, couldn't understand this man's reluctance. After a moment, the attendant submitted as if he had no choice against Z's logic and relented. What do you need? As far as Z knew, the sodas were the only ingestible thing he could find to consume in this place for the foreseeable future, and he didn't want to bother dealing with such excruciating conversations every time he needed a drink. How about a roll of quarters? I've got a 10. Z pulled out the bill and offered it. With no change of expression, the attendant reached out with his spindly fingers and took the money. After his small victory, Z thought about his pistol and what the man had said about this being a gun-free county. Not wanting to leave his heirloom in the saddlebag, which didn't lock, he said, All right, since it seems like I might be staying here a little while longer, let me put my stuff back in my room. The attendant departed for the office as Z retrieved his bundle from the saddlebag. Dread filled his mind at the thought of having to spend another night in the repugnant room, but at least now he had a plan, and with a plan, hope. Reluctantly re-entering the dank room, he tossed his bundle on the bed and quickly fished for the firearm. With the pistol in hand, Z scoured the room, searching for a suitable hiding place for the gun. He settled on stashing it on a ledge underneath the mineral-stained sink. Z then clipped the 2 wedding bands and the engagement ring onto his keychain for safekeeping. Back at the truck, he leaned against the front fender and tugged on his module as he waited. After taking an extended drag, he felt somewhat better. Emerging from the office, the attendant approached Z, clasping $10 worth of loose change in various denominations, mostly nickels, spilling through his fingers as he handed them over to Z. Holding the money with both hands, Z said, Just a sec, and he ran back to the drink machine. After purchasing 2 more drinks, he deposited the remaining cache of coins into his pocket. The weight of the change and the massive bulge it created formed an uncomfortable lump, jingling and threatening to slide his trousers down whenever he moved. Taking the 2 new drinks in one hand and retrieving the open can from his bike with the other, Z heaved himself into the passenger seat of the truck. Outside, the air was clean and fresh. Inside, the cab stank of old man body odor and tobacco spit bottles. Even with the windows down, these smells maintained equal footing. After traveling down the highway out of town for about 5 miles, the attendant turned off the pavement onto an unmarked gravel road. Rolling carefully along, dodging holes and straddling crevices, the truck pushed up the mountainside. Z figured that if this were the attendant's daily commute, no wonder his truck was in such disrepair. Z tried to pay special attention to landmarks as he grew uncertain of their destination. Z was naturally confident and adventurous, but the attendant was exceptionally unfriendly and detached, and for all Z knew, he was being transported towards an ambush from like-minded hillbillies. Z would be murdered by the horde and buried in the woods, never to be seen again. No one in the world knew where he was right now, nor did anyone care. After bumping up the mountainside for 20 or more minutes, they arrived at the attendant's homestead. To the right, at a break in the forest, a shanty house formed an island among deceased lawnmowers, abandoned chicken coops, bee boxes, and other broken down equipment. Years of neglect had allowed a mix of grass, weeds, and saplings to engulf the debris. A labyrinth of worn paths ran like veins through the property. Constructed from a variety of ragtag building materials, the dwelling stood like a disheveled manor. A smattering of malnourished chickens and dogs roamed the premises. "Come on," the attendant said, as if coaxing livestock. Reluctantly, Z slid out of the truck, grabbed his drinks, and followed the attendant down a trail that led behind the house. When they turned the corner, a woman stood waiting outside the back door. Rugged and plain, she was a little wrinkled, but slender and healthy. Her form was chiseled by a lifetime of laborious tasks that accompany a back-to-the-earth lifestyle. From underneath a paisley scarf, wisps of light brown and white hair waved in the wind. Clothed in a pioneer-like dress with subdued colors, she looked very natural standing barefoot on a stepping stone among the clutter. Silently, she stayed still when the attendant announced, "This fella's going to saw some wood," as they passed. Their relationship wasn't obvious. Z guessed the woman was probably 20 years younger than the attendant and closer to his own age. It then occurred to Z that he hadn't been formally introduced to the attendant. Having seen Z's driver's license upon check-in, the attendant would have known Z's given name, Donald Zachariah Robbins, but he had never divulged his own. "Folks call me Z," he blurted out in the woman's direction. Without any acknowledgement, she turned and disappeared into the house. Continuing through the graveyard of forgotten machinery and clusters of out-of-control shrubberies, they arrived at an impressive pole shed. Black and oily, its poles supported a tattered tin roof with sunlight peeping through a multitude of rusty holes. With piles of canisters and random tools scattered about, the shed appeared dedicated to milling lumber. 2 substantial metal racks held a gasoline-powered saw with a massive blade. The wheel spanned at least 3 feet across. Stacked at the rear of the shed, an insurmountable supply of tree trunks awaited. They were still sheathed in their barks, but had their limbs trimmed. The diameters varied, and the lengths ranged from anywhere from 8 to 20 feet long. Halfway between the sawmill and the mountain of wood, a dilapidated tractor waited like an old mule set out to pasture. Missing fenders and an engine cover, a film of oil, grease, and dust disguised the original color. After approaching the contraption, the attendant wrapped a chain around the bucket on its front-end loader, cranked it, then eased the machine up to the stack of logs. Leaving the tractor idling, the attendant climbed down and threaded the chain around the topmost log a couple of times, then hooked it back to itself, reclaimed his seat in the throttle, and cranked the diesel engine to its maximum potential. Old and underpowered, the tractor dripped liquid from several places and billowed pungent fumes as it painstakingly hoisted the timber. Threatening to die a sudden death at any moment, the tractor dragged the log to a conveyor that fed into the mill. The attendant demonstrated how to set the dimensions of the cut and also how to start the saw. He then cut a few boards himself before watching Z saw a few. After switching off the saw, he showed Z how to check the fluids in the machinery and where to find their containers. In his lifetime, Z had held several jobs involving repetitive mechanical operation and physical labor. Even though he'd never operated this specific equipment, this kind of work was not unfamiliar. "All right, you know our deal," the attendant said. "You keep sawing, and I'll come back and get you later tonight." With that, he turned and left. Suddenly awestruck and paralyzed, Z stood motionless before the monstrous task that lay ahead. He heard the thunderous bark of the attendant's truck as it jolted alive in the drive and meandered back down the trail before traveling out of earshot altogether. After standing in silence a few moments more, Z attempted to encourage confidence in himself. He took a deep breath and said aloud, "To work then," and approached the saw. Priming the engine, he slid on the choke and gave the cord a pull. And the saw, instant and brilliant, came to life. Unlike most any other thing he'd encountered in Solem County, the saw was dynamic, powerful, and clean. Starting with the log the attendant had left on the conveyor, Z set to work. The saw effortlessly chewed through its first solo cut. Z forgot for a moment about his predicament as he stared amazed at the efficiency of this mechanical masterpiece. However, he was quickly reminded of his situation when he looked over at the remaining pile of towering logs in the back of the shed. Without incident, he milled the first log, switched off the saw, and stacked the finished lumber before starting on his second. Z mounted the tractor. The ancient apparatus grumbled and complained like an old man in the morning as Z turned the ignition. Eventually, the engine complied with a belch of black smoke, followed by its irregular, rattling idle. Z pulled it over to the pile and hopped off the tractor. He strained his already tired muscles as he fished the chain around the next log. Although his hunger made him feel weak, shaky, and uncomfortable, determination overpowered his senses and urged Z onward. After loading the second log onto the conveyor, he looked despairingly at the 8 finished boards organized in their tidy stack. Z guessed that he had been here an hour now, and so far had only earned 80 cents. He just needed to find his rhythm. When he pulled the saw's cord to begin work on the second log, it cranked up beautifully and spun like before, but when Z started the cut, the blade slowed a little, then stopped altogether. Curious. Though Z followed the startup protocols as dictated, no matter how much he jerked on the cord, the saw would not crank. Z had experienced and overcome minor mechanical malfunctions over his years of disjointed occupations and while tinkering with his bike. He rummaged through the piles of tools beneath the shed until he found a screwdriver, then removed the carburetor, hoping a good cleaning would solve the problem. After spending the better part of his second hour blowing through tiny intake lines, spraying carburetor cleaner, and attaching and removing the carburetor itself, he achieved at last success. With renewed vigor, the resurrected saw hummed as Z started yet again on the second log. Though everything Z touched grew heavier and his movements became more labored, Z forced his body to continue cutting and stacking. After completing the lumber from the second log, he unloaded his mass of loose change in his pocket to a nearby stump along with his keys. Then he removed his belt and added his knife to the pile. The only thing Z kept on him was his wallet, attached to his belt by a chain. Beside his work area, he sat on an overturned plastic bucket to take a vape break and cracked open his next can. He now had 17 finished boards. By his reckoning, Z had been here at least 3 hours, and at this rate, he wouldn't even be able to pay for his room, let alone fix his tire. Calmly, he swallowed the last of his drink and simply sat staring at nothing. With his mind emptied and his face flushed, Z could feel his pulse squeeze through his entire body as his heart forced blood through his dry veins. After a few minutes more, he set back to his task, mustering strength from newfound determination. Loading the third log onto the conveyor, Z discovered that the problem with the saw's motor was a recurring one. He found every time he turned it off, he had to repeat the ritual of cleaning the carburetor. Nevertheless, as the day progressed, he became proficient and able to remove, clean, and reattach the confounded thing in under 5 minutes. After deciphering this hiccup, production carried on without further complications. The work was exhausting. The fumes nauseated Z. He dragged, sawed, stacked, and vaped non-stop for several hours. His completed stack was improving. He labored on until what would have been supper time anywhere else in the world. The attendant hadn't offered access to any food or water, or bathroom for that matter. As he toiled, Z thought about the woman. Although the shack was only some 30 yards away, he had neither seen nor heard any stirrings. But because of their corporate lack of warmth and openness, Z assumed that any attempt to approach the house and ask for anything would not be well received. Back on his makeshift seat, he started his final soda. Besides not mentioning his basic human needs, the attendant had also neglected to give a specific time for his return. He only said later. Feeling compelled not to be caught idle, Z reluctantly convinced himself to get back to work. After a short while more of sawing, he paused to calculate how much he had earned. Desperation reasserted itself as Z realized he still hadn't even made enough to cover payment for his room. As night approached, Z became less concerned about any earnings, only wanting relief from this gargantuan task. As his willpower faded, the time it took for Z to complete a log increased. Then nightfall eventually made it impossible for Z to operate this equipment without risking dismemberment. Leaving the log on the conveyor unfinished, Z sat down in the darkened shop. He could scarcely make out the silhouette of anything. Staring blankly into obscurity, Z's thoughts again returned to the woman. But for the same reason as before, he stayed put. Alone in the darkness and abandoned, he puffed on his mod and waited.